Now that we've gone over the brush tip shape for a capture brush, let's go ahead and take a look at what shape dynamics do. Now keep in mind we have things like spacing, angle, roundness, flip X, flip Y, and size available in the capture brush. If we switch over to shape dynamics, we'll see that there are a lot of corresponding controls. They're just labeled a little differently. We've got size jitter, angle jitter, we have roundness jitter, we have flip X jitter, flip Y jitter, brush projection. We'll come back to that in a minute. So what are these and what are they doing? So in the event of a snail with a really reasonable space between it so we can see what's going on, I've got spacing of 93, so slight overlap. We can control the size. Watch what happens when I move size jitter from 0% to 100%. We're getting different sized snails. Now, it's randomly determining how large and small that is within a certain amount of jitter. Now, to be honest, in older versions, it seemed like a fairly straightforward algorithm. It simply took half of whatever the original size was. So in this case, we have 125 pixels and it would apply those going up and down. So, and by half, I mean, if it's at 100%, half of that down, half of that up, 100% variation. These days, I don't see it getting any bigger than you originally selected. It simply shrinks it down to some amount as it goes through. So the size jitter will control that, and you can see the preview stroke changes as well as you crank this on and up and down. Now there's a little bit more going on. We have a minimum diameter scale that becomes apparent when we've adjusted the size jitter or when you pick certain controls like dial, fade, that sort of thing. So let's leave it at off for just a moment and we'll do size jitter. And then just with size jitter, we'll increase the minimum diameter. Notice that how small this can shrink has changed. Despite the fact that I've cranked this up to 100%, the smallest it's ever going to get is half of 100%. So in this case, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Why would you want this with your size jitter? Wouldn't you normally want a minimum diameter pretty low? Well, it has to do with the controls. So let's turn off size jitter for a moment and switch it from off to fade. Now at 25, we're not going to really know what it's doing. It seems to just be fading things away to nothing, and it's a little unclear why. Let's actually knock this down to 5, and now it becomes more apparent. It paints 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 snails before disappearing. Now you might think, not a problem, I'll just increase the size jitter. Well, great, now the size of each of those snails is random, but it still fades away entirely. Now the minimum diameter comes into play. After the 5th snail, it reaches the minimum diameter of 0, but if we crank that up to just 1%, it will have 5 randomly sized snails, and then a trail of infinite snails going on of whatever percentage we set into the size diameter. So that's what's going on there. And we could crank this up to something like 400, I don't know. And then you could have a whole bunch of snails that gradually become smaller and smaller and smaller until it hits a minimum size, and then the jitter stops being applied. You just have a tiny, tiny brush instead. That could be fun for crowd scenes and things. I'm going to crank this back down to 5 just so that we can see the process. So just to demonstrate, if the minimum diameter is 100%, essentially it's off. I'm not sure why it doesn't cop out at 99%, but I'm sure there's a good reason. At 0%, it disappears forever. Anywhere in between, it will bobble around for a bit. If I remove size jitter entirely, it will simply shrink this down by a scaled view. So this should be 1/5 the size of the original one, and then it will hit whatever minimum diameter I have, and that's done. And so that's essentially the size jitter. That's relating to dynamically controlling the size. Now we've got flip X and flip Y. So if we come back over here and set this to off, so we just have standard snail again. We have the flip X jitter and flip Y jitter. Now remember what flip X and flip Y was doing earlier. The flip X, flip Y jitter will randomly flip it, in this case flip X, left and right. So I can make one stroke, and let me just do this up and down so you can see. And you can see that occasionally the snail is facing another direction. Yeah, this should be at random. It's like coin flipping. It seems to favor, though, one direction or another, even though it's supposed to be somewhat random, which is interesting to me. I'm going to increase the size of the snail a little bit. And you can see how he's flipped around kind of randomly going on there. All right, so we also have the flip Y jitter. Sometimes he's upside down, sometimes he's right side up. Flip X and Y, now he's all over the place. Who knows what direction he's going to go on? Pretty crazy. All right, why would you have that? Well, let's say we did some random dots of black and white and we captured that. We went to Edit, Define Brush Preset. We just did a capture brush. And we had a capture brush. Now, this seems pretty dull. And in fact, it is. I don't really like that color for this. Let's go ahead and use more of a blue-purple. There we go. All right. So with just using shape dynamics, let me turn that on, flipping X and flipping Y suddenly makes this a more interesting brush right away. Adding in a little bit of size jitter makes it a lot more interesting very, very quickly. Now it doesn't just look like some boring stamp. It looks like it might actually be some kind of fuzzy brush happening right away. Pretty crazy, right? Okay, let's switch back to the snail for just a moment. Hey, cute snail. And let's switch to another color for the snail. Boom. All right, we've got the snail. Let's go back to shape dynamics, turn that back on. And now we've got something called angle jitter. Well, actually we have tilt scale, but that has to do with if we have pen tilt, and it will control the scaling of the tilt. Let's see if this version of the Cintiq has a tilt. Looks like it might. It sure does. All right. So let's play with that. Hold on. Decrease the size of the snail. All right. So if I just, yellow is not really cutting it. Let's do something darker. All right. So right now, just a standard line. If I tilt the pen, it will do in this case, a size jitter, because that's what I have going on. So notice how it's increasing and decreasing slightly in size. That's because the tilt is controlling that. So I can, and the tilt is just the angle of the pen to the tablet that you're on. So I can increase or decrease that scale to get different effects. In this case, my tilt sensitivity is not particularly good on here. So the difference between a very high tilt scale and a very low tilt scale is almost non-existent. You can see a slight change. Newer tablets will have better tilt sensitivity in it, which will allow it to pick that up. And the tilt scale is just how far do you need to tilt it for there to be an effect. Sorry, I said that wrong. The tilt scale is just how much the tilt is affecting it. There we go. So having it off means that it's not going to affect it at all. Having it on fade, still not available because it's set specifically for the pen tilt. Makes sense, right? Let's put it back to off. So we have angle jitter, which will correspond to the angle here. I crank up spacing so we can see the snail a little bit better. And delete that. There we go. In fact, now I bet we could see the tilt a little bit better even on my old Cintiq here. If we set this to pen tilt. Oh, there we go. You can see the different sizes depending on how tilted the pen is. Now, I'm having some driver issues. You can see this little warning icon means that it doesn't think that I have pen tilt at all. I do, I'm able to control it, but this is thinking that it doesn't have it. That's just some driver issues. It's an older Cintiq with a newer operating system. Windows doesn't always keep up to date, neither does Wacom with those things. You have a stylus wheel if you have that available. And I don't actually have one. I think though, nope, that doesn't do it either. Sometimes they'll be mapped to different pieces on your tablet, sometimes a touch strip, that kind of thing. Although I did have the meter off, so it's hard to say that would have actually done anything. No, it does not. Okay, well, good to know. Let me clear that out. All right, leave that off. So angle jitter, I keep walking away from that, is literally a reference to the angle, which is why I switched back to the snail so that we can see this happening. And increase the angle jitter so it's random. You can see it spinning all around. as I just make it, even if I make it in a straight line. Doop, 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 doop. The snail is randomly being flipped around. Doop, 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 doop. And if I instead control it by, say, direction, well, we know what that does. It's following the direction of the mouse as I move the mouse around. I can also control it according to fade, which, surprise, surprise, I have it way too high for it to be really seeable. Let me clear that out. Let's do it on instead 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so it will do some rotation and then it pops back to where it was, which I think is quite fun. We have a dial if you have one available on your tablet or on your computer. Sometimes some keyboards will have those. I haven't seen any in years, so I kind of doubt that they still make them, but maybe they do. You never know. You have pen pressure, which is fun. Oh, it's not picking up my pen pressure now, so that's exciting. Let's see if it will really do it. Oh yeah, it's still doing it. So depending on if I go soft or hard on my stroke as I press it, it will rotate the snail around. I can also set it to be the tilt stylus wheel. Really? Oh, well, not in this case. I was thinking it was my mouse, but it clearly says stylus. I just got excited. Rotation, which is actually not a reference to you spinning your mouse around, but to your pen. This one doesn't have it, but on some Cintiqs, rotating the pen is detected as a change. Same with some Wacom tablets and a handful of other devices that are out there. If you spin the stylus around, that is the little digital pen, it will cause it to spin around with rotation. I like that a lot for angle because you can spin it. This particular model doesn't have that, unfortunately. Initial direction is pretty cool. It should bring it back to the initial direction eventually. Let's see if it'll do that. Yep. Almost. Let me take a... Oh, right. No, I'm sorry. I've got this wrong. Let me clear this out. It's the initial direction that you're dragging it. So let me knock off angle jitter. It's actually covering what it's doing. The initial direction that I drag, regardless of where I go now, will determine the direction forever. See how it's just rotated up and down? That's it. That's actually a fun one. Since I have the angle jitter up, it was covering that and I immediately lost track of what I was doing. Sorry about that. Initial direction. That's a fun one. So we'll lock in. So depending on your stroke, it will keep it in that direction. So yeah, it's good for a lot of cases. I think that a lot of times though, just direction in general is going to meet your needs, just depending on what you're doing. You have roundness jitter. Guess which one that controls? Back at the brush tip shape, we have roundness at 100%. It's essentially a circle. But if you grab the corners and squeeze them in and out, it will squash or de-squish the capture brush. There we go. And so guess what the jitter does? Sure enough, it will randomly squish and de-squish the brush. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and instead, oh, it also has a minimum roundness. Let me not forget that. So you could decrease it and make it really squishy sometimes. But you can set this control with or without the minimum roundness. You can set the control to be something like pen tilt, which I think is pretty cool. And again, unfortunately, this does not detect pen tilt on my, well, it's kind of detecting it. I thought this had it, but like I said, I'm having some driver issues. Yeah, it's kind of doing it. Here we go. Let me tilt my pen a lot. There we go. And not at all. Yeah, so it is actually picking it up. So a lot to none. There we go. So it can control essentially how flat this is. This works nicely sometimes if you're building a chisel tipped thing. So in other words, if you crank the spacing down and then you squash it a whole lot to begin with, you can come over to shape dynamics and you can set it to the pen tilt and it will tilt and untilt it within a certain parameter. This works great too if you also set the size to pressure. You can build some fun stuff pretty quickly depending on what you're doing, which is great. And you can also set angle jitter to pen tilt, which gets really crazy. If you do a stroke, you can see that it's doing all kinds of insane stuff up over here. Pretty cool, right? Now let me reset all of this. Oh, you can also do a fade on this, which is fun. And then you have minimum roundness. We can crank that down. Well, let me bring this back up to 100% here. So this will fade over time. You can see how it becomes flatter and flatter. So I think that one's a fun one too. All right, so those are just some of the controls that relate directly to the brush shape. But we have one more in here. I'm going to reset all of this by going up and clearing brush controls, turning on shape dynamics again. So you got our snail. Notice that resetting the brush controls did not reset the angle, so watch out for that. It also shouldn't reset the roundness, so beware. On the shape dynamics, I'm going to go to brush projection. Right now it looks like not much is happening. Let me switch over to my Cintiq. And unfortunately, because I have it so spaced together, it's really not showing up very well. Let me increase the spacing. All right, what this is supposed to do is track the tilt and stamp it down with a warp. Now the problem, as I was saying earlier, is that my particular pen doesn't have a very good tilt track in it. It's a very old one. So even though it's supposed to pick it up, it's not picking up particularly well. But think of it this way. As you adjust the brush, I'm just going to switch to a little square brush real quick so I can actually draw a diagram. Let me just pop in some white with Control Delete in a default color and grab a normal brush. Think of it this way. So if you tilt the brush, it'll be like a garden hose spraying out water, or a flashlight, or a projector, or anything. Think of it as anything like that. Projector is probably better. So if you had the pen straight up and down, it should stamp down the snail without any problem. But if you tilt the pen, it would do a large distortion to the snail itself, resulting in a very distorted snail. And depending on the angle that you tilt this thing, it will have a bigger and bigger distortion to the snail or whatever capture brush you have going on. So why is that useful? Well, it can do some text effects very beautifully that are very hard to do otherwise. For example, if we were to come over to a new document and type in something like Batman and transform that Batman. Hey, Batman. And maybe capture Batman by doing an edit define brush preset. Call this Batman. Batman. All right, so come over here, increase the spacing a whole lot. So we've got Batman, right? Batman. So if we go over to shape dynamics on Batman, we can do brush projection. And then you can see a little bit of it. Depending on the tip, we can get kind of a different Batman signal. So if you think of like the bat signal pointed at the sky and reflecting off of different stuff, we could do recall. Now maybe text was a bad example. An actual bat icon would have been better, but it may have been copyright infringement. So let's stick with the word Batman. Now, I'm sure you're sitting here thinking, but what if you have a mouse? What if you're on a laptop? What are you supposed to do? Guess what? You can change your brush pose by going to brush pose and overriding things like tilt and overriding things like rotation. And you can build a very specific Batman. Unfortunately, you get a terrible preview. You can build a very specific Batman to be, the bat signal in this case. And we could change the rotation a little bit or a whole lot. The one downside to this is that at least in the current version of Photoshop, you don't get a preview of it, but it does allow you to make do when you're on like a laptop and you've got to get going and just get some of these out, or if you're just with a mouse, it works really great. The one downside, of course, being you can't really see what you're doing. So a pen tablet works a lot better, but hey, you've got the brush pose. Honestly, this can be a lifesaver. There are a lot of times that there's a text effect you really want to get by just doing a simple distortion a few times, and you can do it instantly with a tilt sensitive brush. And it's a pain to just do a whole bunch of transformations on a whole bunch of different, texts. So depending on what you're doing, this can be really powerful to use text with a brush. All right, so that's essentially the shape dynamics. I don't think I missed anything. If I did, let me know and I will add on some more, but we still need to cover scattering, texture, dual brush, color dynamics, transfer, brush pose. Well, we kind of touched on brush pose, but there's a little bit more. And then once we've done all that, we'll be heading back to brush tip to look at our other types of brushes. So I will see you in the next video for scattering,